The majority of officers present on May 31st were ready to be violent. As I stood with other protesters side by side, and that was all we did. We stood and we chanted. We did not punch, we did not kick, we did not twist arms, we did not pepper spray. We did not headlock, we did not drag or throw human bodies to the concrete. Instead, these were all actions used by the VPD while all we did was stand. Officers did not use any de-escalation. They were clearly instructed to be violent and use as much force as they wanted. Even their first moves were to inflict pain. One officer's very first move was to choke a woman half his size. He did not push her or even grab and arrest her. Instead, he went directly for the throat. Another disgusting act and stain on the VPD's violent history. Even as we were moved off the train tracks and retreated into a parking lot, they continued to be violent. Many of us tried pleading with the officers, but it was like talking to enraged bulls. Many officers wouldn't even make eye contact with us. They only spoke with their violence. And as we often see, whether it is the IOF or the VPD, they will dehumanize civilians and then commit their violence. Some officers were much more extreme than others. A great example is police officer Dimitri Scheinerman, who was present on May 31st and extremely violent. Scheinerman is the same officer who was caught wearing a Punisher skull and Israeli flag patch on his uniform, which is against VPD policy. The skull and patch is a known racist and violent symbol. The skull was worn by many white nationalists, including at rallies in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. This same patch is also worn by many IOF soldiers. Ori Gavati, an Israeli activist who has researched the patch's prevalence in Israel, stated, "When we wear the skull on our uniforms, we are sending a clear message. We are not here to protect. We are here to attack and to frighten." These words are a perfect example of the VPD and Officer Dimitri Scheinerman's actions on May 31st. They were not here to protect. They were here to attack and frighten us. When images of Scheinerman's patch went viral online, the VPD on February 15th responded saying, "This patch is not an approved part of the VPD uniform, and the officer has been directed to remove it." No other actions were taken by the VPD. Even worse, they continued to place Scheinerman at countless Palestine protests despite public outcry. A remarkable example of VPD's negligence and a lack of care for public safety. His actions on May 31st clearly could have been prevented. Instead, I watched as Scheinerman grabbed someone who was already being held by another officer and put them into a headlock, and then dropped them to the ground using their head. An extremely dangerous and unnecessary move on a protester who was being nonviolent. Later on, other officers had to physically pull Scheinerman from the front of the police line to the very back due to his extremely violent and unprovoked behavior. Those officers tried to clean up what was already done. They tried to clean up what the staff sergeants could have prevented. And those staff sergeants and higher-ups at the VPD should be ashamed of themselves. They have a clear lack of vetting which officers are placed at protests and do nothing to prevent how violent these officers are. The 14 protesters arrested did not commit violence. The charges are ridiculous and should be dropped immediately. We should be looking at who is committing the only violence that day. That is why we demand Dimitri Scheinerman be suspended for the violence he committed on May 31st. And we demand he be kept away from all protests. But instead, I'm sure we'll continue to witness the negligence of the VPD staff sergeants. Scheinerman is not a rarity. He is the norm at the VPD. And it takes a good amount of blind ignorance and privilege to not see the ongoing violence the VPD commits on a daily. I myself was slapped in the face, had my arm twisted, and was pushed to the ground. but that is a minor example of the other injuries sustained on May 31st, and also of what happens daily in so-called Vancouver. The very next day after experiencing this violence, I looked on my phone and I saw a story on CTV of an unarmed Indigenous woman being shot to the ground by an officer's beanbag gun. While she was on the ground screaming in pain, VPD officers are seen standing above her and laughing. This violence happens daily. This violence is what our Indigenous brothers, sisters, and siblings have been facing since the VPD and RCMP were created. The violence by the VPD on May 31st is just one of the countless examples of how they're not here to protect the people. It shows they are here to protect property and to protect Canada's complicity and involvement in a genocide. But this violence will not frighten us. It will only bring us closer together. This violence only awakens more people to the VPD's disgusting history. This violence continues to show us the need to defund, abolish, and put resources elsewhere to create a better and safe future for us all.